happen to know you do a little teaching.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about how that helps and or influences the actual work. I mean, by having to deconstruct something and figure out how it works in order to teach it, does that help you with the writing itself, or is it too...
Boy, you know, it is really kind of two different things. I teach very infrequently now. I teach some seminars, and then I teach one class at BYU, only one semester a year. Mm-hmm. So I don't do a lot of it anymore. I used to do more. I just don't have time any longer. It does help to think about my process and try and break it down, but it is like there's two parts of my brain: the teacher and the teacher/scholar and the writer. And the writer doesn't worry too much about these things. The writer does what feels natural, and then the teacher-scholar looks at it and says, "Oh, that's why that's working.
Yeah.
Maybe I can explain this to people." But I definitely in my class take more of a tack of here is a professional writer, and here's how I go about doing my things, rather than talking about it. I try to keep away from doing too much on the academic side and focusing more on the craftsman side.
Yeah. So talking about crafting and talking about epic fantasy, I'm really interested in the definitions for epic, because I think they're used differently by readers.
They are
by writers
and by reviewers, by publicists. Everybody has,
And so I'd love to know your definition. I had a conversation recently with Daniel Abraham, and we were talking about the degree to which epicness can be distilled and reduced sometimes just to the examination of a single life.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And of course this is theoretical,
right.
Maybe we're being a little bit too sort of inclusive in what we're thinking about, but I'm really interested in when you talk about epic fantasy, some people see a great big book like this and it's long, it's epic. How do you think about epic when, in this genre definitions?
There are so many definitions, and picking one and saying it's right and this one's wrong, I mean, we all get shelved in the same place. So in the end, it's all a matter of distinctions. I like one of the things I've noticed, interestingly, about epic fantasy is that the books that they seem most similar to in the bookstore aren't always the other fantasies, but are sometimes the historicals. If you talk to, when people would interview Robert Jordan and say, what is your book like? He would usually liken it to historical epics. Yeah. He would say War and Peace or something like this. Because if you really look at it, in some ways, a book like Lord of the Rings has more in common with Moby Dick than it does with for instance, Conan. But both of those are in one section of the bookstore, and others, and Moby Dick's in another. But this whole idea of introducing a new world that's very unfamiliar, adding lots of complexity to character interactions and family trees and these sorts of things is stuff that you see in historical works. What is the definition of epic? For me, an epic, the distinction for an epic is generally multiple viewpoints, not just one person. That's one thing that I look at. But again, you say it could be an examination of a single life. I mean, is Les Miserables an epic by examining Jean Valjean's life throughout many years? And I would say yes. But the multitude of viewpoints from different walks of life, one person going through different walks of life, or lots of different people going through different walks of life. Epic fantasy does tend to have this sort of, it involves many cultures and many societies, and it's fates of kingdoms, not and fates of worlds, rather than fates of individuals or fates of families. But this is all fluid. It is what you define it as being, and it's so hard. You have to know what the other definitions are to say, well, is it this or this? I mean, usually the old standby definitions have kind of been, you've got epic fantasy, you've got heroic fantasy, right? Epic fantasy being the Tolkien line of these historical sort of, historical novels in worlds that don't exist. And the heroic line of the sort of the Robert Howard and the it came up through Druss the Legend. And then a lot of people will look at George R. R. Martin and say, okay, heroic fantasy. It's kind of in that line of kind of the gritty realism. We're not doing high magic, we're doing low magic, if any magic. People are dying right and left. But then on the epic side, they say, no, Martin's epic because you've got this, it's the story of a family across generations and across years and the rise and fall of kingdoms. And so you've got him right in the intersection of what people would term heroic and epic. And then you've got stuff like, you know, where does urban fantasy / whatever, you know, I guess it depends on how many subgenres you're dividing things into.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and so this is why these conversations are wonderful at cons, because everybody argues on the panel for an hour, and then you leave being more confused than when you started.
Yeah. Sometimes I've thought a lot of it's reader experience too.
Yeah.
You know, someone could come away from Les Mis and think, wow, how epic.
Yeah.
I wanted to engage you a little bit on that. So thanks for indulging me.
Right.
So I've heard a couple of on panels. I've been at cons. This topic explored where it's posited, if I can use that word, that fantasy is one of the last great genres to explore the dichotomy of good and evil. You know, and not simply to make the big dark overlord and, you know, and the other guy, and Snidely Whiplash and Dudley Do-Right, but that it's clear that there are distinctions there, where a lot of other fictions actually, I think, they kind of delight in the fact that everything's in the gray.
Yeah.
How do you think about that? Do you think fantasy is one of the last great genres for these kinds of explorations, or is that a false kind of...
You know, I've heard that a lot at conventions. I've heard people talk about it a lot. It is not something that I think about a lot. I do like to tell stories about people, how shall I say? I have the belief that people are basically good. This is just one of the things that I believe. And
it's
I
like a worldview of yours.
Yeah, it's a worldview of mine. And I like to tell stories. Therefore, you know, my characters, some of them are not completely good, but there's goodness in all of them. And there's, you know, people are more complex than good or evil. People are motivations and desires and passions. And yet I'm writing in a genre where, in some cases, I really do just want to have a good, solid, heroic individual who does what's right. And you read Elantris, and that's one of my founding principles of that book was I just want to have a character who you know, he is a good person. He has been raised somehow right, despite the fact that his father is not a good person. He chooses the good choices. And I wanted to tell a story about someone who didn't have a deep, dark secret in their past and was tortured by it. But at the same time, deep, dark secrets in your past that torture you make for great fiction. And so, yes, epic fantasy does that. Yes, it can. It's one of the few places I think that you do it and people don't bat an eye. But at the same time, that kind of bothers me a little bit because it seems like a lot of people that I've talked to who write epic fantasy and put in these moral paradigms of good and evil themselves don't have that worldview. And so what is it they're doing when they're creating these fantasies? Are they saying, oh, you fantasy readers, I will play into your simplistic worldview and give you this? Or, you know...
That's interesting. Yeah.
And you talk to a lot of fantasy writers, and they say, no, that's not what I'm doing. I want to have characters who are interesting, and nobody chooses the right path all the time. And sometimes the good person making the wrong decisions is much more fascinating than the good person making the good decisions. And so, I don't know. It's so hard because I think a lot of writers who are more gritty than me would point at my books and say, oh yeah, those are black and white. And yet I look at them and say, no, I don't feel that I've ever actually written a completely evil villain. In fact, I don't think in terms of villains. My books don't have villains. My books have people who are not necessarily making the same choices that other people are making, and perhaps not even the right choices. But that really depends on your point of view and your worldview. So I guess I'm giving you nothing on this one because I don't know.
No, it's a good conversation. I think it maybe goes a little back to reader experience, because how someone views the decision the character makes really may be influenced a little bit by their own worldview.